World War II ended in 1945. The Allied victory brought relief, but it also brought new tensions. The US, UK, and Soviet Union had fought together against Nazi Germany. However, their wartime alliance masked deep ideological differences. These differences soon rose to the surface. The US and UK championed democracy and capitalism. They envisioned a post-war world based on free trade and self-determination. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin had different plans. Stalin aimed to expand Soviet influence and spread communism. He sought to create a buffer zone of satellite states in Eastern Europe. These states would be loyal to Moscow. The seeds of mistrust were sown early. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, the Allies agreed to divide Germany into occupation zones. Berlin, though located within the Soviet zone, would also be divided. This agreement, meant to ensure stability, became a source of future conflict. The wartime alliance was unraveling. The Grand Alliance was no more. The stage was set for a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. As the Red Army pushed back the Nazis, Stalin moved quickly to establish control over Eastern Europe. He installed communist regimes in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. These regimes were often brutal. They suppressed dissent and eliminated opposition. In Czechoslovakia, initially a democracy, the communists seized power in 1948. This was the Prague coup. It sent shockwaves through the West. It demonstrated the ruthless efficiency of Soviet methods. Yugoslavia, under Josip Broz Tito, presented a unique challenge. Tito was a communist, but he resisted Soviet domination. He maintained Yugoslavia's independence. This defiance enraged Stalin. It highlighted the limits of Soviet control. Winston Churchill, though no longer Prime Minister, recognized the danger posed by Soviet expansionism. In 1946, he delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. He warned of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. He spoke of Soviet influence stretching from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. Churchill's speech was a wake-up call for the West. It crystallized the growing East-West divide. It also infuriated Stalin, who saw it as a provocation. The speech solidified the emerging Cold War narrative, a struggle between democracy and communism. The Truman Doctrine, announced in 1947, marked a turning point in American foreign policy. It declared that the United States would support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. This was a direct response to Soviet actions in Greece and Turkey. Both countries faced communist insurgencies. The Truman Doctrine signaled America's commitment to containing communism. It marked the beginning of the containment policy. This policy would guide US foreign policy for decades. Section 5, the Marshall Plan, Rebuilding Europe, Resisting Soviet Influence. The Marshall Plan, also launched in 1947, was an ambitious economic recovery program for Europe. It offered aid to all European countries, including those under Soviet influence. The goal was to rebuild war-torn economies and, prevent the spread of communism. Stalin saw the Marshall Plan as a threat. He forbade Soviet satellite states from accepting aid. He viewed it as an attempt to extend American influence. The Marshall Plan was a success for the West. It helped to revive Western European economies and strengthen ties with the United States. Section 6, A City Divided, the Berlin Blockade and Airlift. Berlin, a city divided, became a focal point of Cold War tensions. In 1948, Stalin imposed a blockade on West Berlin. He cut off all land and water access to the city. His aim was to force the Western Allies to abandon West Berlin. The US and its allies responded with the Berlin Airlift. For over a year, they airlifted supplies to West Berlin. This extraordinary effort demonstrated Western resolve. It also humiliated Stalin, who was forced to lift the blockade in 1949. Section 7. The formation of NATO, a bulwark against Soviet aggression. The Berlin blockade convinced Western powers that they needed a collective security alliance. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was formed. Its founding members included the US, Canada, and 10 Western European nations. NATO's core principle was collective defense. An attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. This alliance was a direct response to the perceived Soviet threat. It solidified the division of Europe into two armed camps. Section 8, the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet response to NATO. In 1955, 6 years after the formation of NATO, the Soviet Union responded by creating its own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. This pact included the Soviet Union and its satellite states in Eastern Europe. The Warsaw Pact was the Soviet counterweight to NATO. It formalized the division of Europe into two opposing blocs. The creation of these alliances increased tensions. It made the Cold War a global confrontation. Section 9 Conclusion: A World on the Brink. The years following World War II witnessed the rapid descent into the Cold War. The wartime alliance between the US, UK, and Soviet Union crumbled under the weight of ideological differences and mistrust. Stalin's actions in Eastern Europe, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Blockade, and the formation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact all contributed to the hardening of divisions. By the early 1950s, the world was divided into two heavily armed camps poised on the brink of a conflict that threatened to engulf the entire planet. Gap 3S, Section 10, the Korean War, a proxy battle. As the Cold War intensified, the Korean Peninsula became the first significant battleground in this global struggle between East and West. In 1950, North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, launched a surprise invasion of South Korea. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, swiftly intervened to support South Korea, marking the first direct military confrontation of the Cold War. Gap 2S. The fighting was brutal and relentless, with both sides suffering massive casualties. Cities were razed and millions of civilians were displaced, their lives forever altered by the conflict. The Korean War was not only a test of military might, but also of political resolve, as each superpower sought to extend its influence in Asia. Gap 2S. Despite the immense destruction, the war ended in a stalemate in 1953, with the Korean peninsula remaining divided along the 38th parallel. The armistice agreement brought an uneasy peace, but the scars of the conflict ran deep. The Korean War set the stage for future proxy wars, where the superpowers would clash indirectly, using other nations as battlegrounds. Gap 2S. The Korean War was a stark reminder of the devastating potential of the Cold War. It underscored the lengths to which both the United States and the Soviet Union were willing to go to maintain their spheres of influence, even at the cost of millions of lives. As the world watched, the shadow of nuclear annihilation loomed ever larger, and the Cold War continued its relentless march forward. Gap 2S. The Korean War marked a turning point, solidifying the ideological divide and ensuring that the Cold War would be fought not just in Europe, but on a global stage. The lessons of Korea would echo through the decades, shaping the strategies and policies of both superpowers as they navigated a world on the brink of destruction. Scene 11. The Space Race. A new frontier. As the Cold War raged on Earth, a new battleground emerged in the skies above. The space race between the United States and the Soviet Union was not just a quest for technological supremacy, but a demonstration of ideological prowess. It began in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit. This unprecedented achievement sent shockwaves through the United States, igniting fears of Soviet dominance in space. Gap 2S. In response, America accelerated its own space program, culminating in the creation of NASA in 1958. The space race became a high-stakes competition, with both superpowers pouring vast resources into their efforts to conquer the final frontier. The Soviets achieved several early milestones, including sending the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into space in 1961. His historic flight was a triumph for Soviet science and a powerful symbol of communist prowess. Gap 2S. Not to be outdone, President John F. Kennedy boldly declared that the United States would send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade's end. This ambitious goal galvanized the American public and spurred a series of groundbreaking missions. The Apollo program faced numerous challenges, but perseverance and ingenuity paid off. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to set foot on the lunar surface, marking a monumental victory for the United States. Gap 2S. the space race was more than a series of technological feats. It was a powerful narrative of human aspiration and geopolitical rivalry. It showcased the best of human ingenuity and the intense competition between two superpowers vying for global influence. As astronauts and cosmonauts ventured into the unknown, the world watched in awe, and the Cold War extended its reach beyond the confines of our planet. GAP-2S, the space race, left an indelible mark on history, fostering advancements in science and technology that continue to benefit humanity. It also highlighted the potential for peaceful cooperation, as evidenced by the later joint missions between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the end, the space race was a testament to what humanity could achieve when driven by the twin forces of competition and curiosity, even amid the tensions of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a close call. GAP-2S. In October 1962, the world stood on the brink of nuclear annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the Cold War ever came to erupting into a full-scale nuclear conflict. It began when American reconnaissance planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. GAP-2S, President John F. Kennedy faced an unprecedented dilemma. Allowing the missiles to remain would mean accepting a grave threat to American national security. Removing them, however, risked igniting a war with the Soviet Union. After intense deliberation, Kennedy decided on a naval blockade or quarantine to prevent further Soviet shipments of military equipment to Cuba. GAP-2S. For 13 agonizing days, the world held its breath as the two superpowers engaged in a tense standoff. Back-channel communications between Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev were fraught with urgency and the possibility of miscalculation. The fate of millions hung in the balance. GAP-2S. The crisis reached its peak when a U.S. reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba and the American military prepared for a possible invasion. However, cooler heads prevailed. Through a series of secret negotiations, Kennedy and Khrushchev reached a compromise. The Soviet Union would dismantle its missiles in Cuba, and the United States would publicly declare it would not invade Cuba. Additionally, the US secretly agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which were a similar threat to the Soviet Union. GAP-2S. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point in the Cold War. It highlighted the dire need for better communication between the superpowers and led to the establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline, a direct communication link to prevent future crises. GAP-2S. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains a stark reminder of the dangers of nuclear brinkmanship and the importance of diplomacy in resolving conflicts. It was a close call that demonstrated the devastating potential of the Cold War and the resilience of human diplomacy in the face of existential threats. GAP-2S. The lessons learned from this perilous episode continue to resonate, reminding us of the crucial need for dialogue, understanding, and the relentless pursuit of peace in a world fraught with tension. The Vietnam War, a divisive conflict. GAP-2S. The Vietnam War was one of the most contentious and polarizing conflicts of the 20th century. Unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, the Vietnam War would drag on for nearly 2 decades, leaving deep scars on the American psyche and altering the course of history. GAP-2S. It began as a fight against colonialism, with Vietnamese forces battling French colonial rule. However, after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the conflict morphed into a Cold War battleground. The country was divided into communist North Vietnam and anti-communist South Vietnam, setting the stage for a protracted and bloody conflict. GAP-2S. The United States, deeply committed to the policy of containment, sought to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. American involvement escalated after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, which led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving President Lyndon B. Johnson broad powers to wage war in Vietnam. GAP-2S. What followed was a grueling and controversial war marked by guerrilla warfare, heavy bombing campaigns, and significant civilian casualties. The conflict was not just fought in the jungles of Vietnam, but also in the hearts and minds of the American people. GAP-2S. The war sparked widespread protests and a powerful anti-war movement, with images of the conflict broadcast into living rooms across America. The My Lai massacre, Kent State shootings, and the Pentagon Papers further fueled public dissent and eroded trust in the government, Gap 2S. By 1973, the United States had withdrawn its combat troops, but the war continued until 1975, when North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, unifying the country under communist rule. The legacy of the Vietnam War is complex and multifaceted. It raised profound questions about American foreign policy, the limits of military power, and the human cost of war. Gap 2S. The Vietnam War remains a poignant reminder of the devastating impacts of ideological conflicts and the importance of learning from history to avoid repeating past mistakes. It was a divisive conflict that left a lasting impact on all who lived through it and continues to shape our understanding of war and peace. Gap 2AS. The lessons from Vietnam echo through the annals of history, urging us to carefully consider the implications of military intervention and the value of pursuing diplomatic solutions to global conflicts. Détente a thaw in the Cold War. Gap 2S. As the Vietnam War was ending, the world started to change again. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, there was a period called détente. This was a time when the United States and the Soviet Union, who were enemies in the Cold War, tried to be less tense with each other. Gap 2S. During détente, they talked a lot to avoid a nuclear war and make the world a safer place. Gap 2S. One important thing that happened during détente was the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT. In 1972, they signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which limited missiles. This was a big deal because it slowed down the arms race. Gap 2S. Another big moment was the Helsinki Accords in 1975. 35 countries, including the United States and the Soviet Union, met to talk about important things like safety, human rights, the economy, and science. This was a big step in making things better between the East and the West. Gap 2S. Not everyone liked détente. Some people thought it let the Soviet Union become too strong, especially in other parts of the world. Others thought it was necessary to avoid a nuclear war. Gap 2S. Even though it wasn't perfect, détente was a big change from the fighting of earlier years. It was a time when people had hope and tried to talk things out instead of threatening each other with war. Gap 2S. Détente shows us that talking to each other is important, even when countries don't agree. It reminds us that we can find ways to work together, even when things are tense. Gap 2S. Even though the Cold War continued for many years, détente taught us valuable lessons about peace. It showed us that even when countries have different beliefs, they can still find common ground and create a safer world through talking and respect. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a quagmire. Just as the world began to hope for lasting peace, a new conflict shattered these aspirations. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, marking a significant escalation in the Cold War. The invasion was intended to support the struggling communist government in Afghanistan, but it quickly turned into a prolonged and bloody conflict. The rugged terrain and fierce resistance from Afghan guerrilla fighters, known as the Mujahideen, made the war a nightmare for Soviet forces. The United States, viewing the invasion as Soviet expansionism, provided substantial support to the Mujahideen, including weapons and training. This proxy war further strained US-Soviet relations. The conflict had devastating effects on Afghanistan, leading to massive civilian casualties and widespread destruction. It also drained Soviet resources and morale, contributing to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is often referred to as the Soviet Vietnam due to its costly and unwinnable nature. It serves as a grim reminder of the human and political costs of Cold War conflicts. This chapter in history highlights the complexities and tragedies of global power struggles, emphasizing the importance of seeking peaceful resolutions over military interventions. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan left scars that still affect the region and the world today, a testament to the enduring consequences of Cold War rivalries. The fall of the Berlin Wall, a symbolic end. As the Cold War dragged on, the world yearned for a sign of hope, a beacon of change. That sign came on November 9, 1989, when the Berlin Wall, the most potent symbol of the division between East and West, began to crumble. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall had stood as a stark reminder of the ideological battle between communism and democracy. separating families, friends, and a nation. The seeds of change were sown by the growing unrest in Eastern Europe. The people, tired of oppression and yearning for freedom, began to push back against their communist regimes. In East Germany, the pressure reached a boiling point. Protests swelled, and the calls for reform grew louder. The government's attempt to quell the unrest with concessions only fueled the desire for more significant change. Then, in a moment that would be etched in history, an East German government official mistakenly announced that travel restrictions to the west would be lifted immediately. Thousands of East Germans flocked to the wall, overwhelming the border guards. In a stunning turn of events, the guards, unsure of what to do, opened the gates. Scenes of jubilation erupted as East and West Germans embraced, danced, and celebrated their newfound freedom. People began chipping away at the wall, breaking it down piece by piece. The world watched in awe as the symbol of division was dismantled, brick by brick. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. It signaled a shift towards democracy and freedom in Eastern Europe, and paved the way for the reunification of Germany. It was a moment of triumph for the human spirit, a testament to the power of hope and the desire for unity. The images of that night remain vivid in our collective memory. The tears of joy, the hugs, the cheers. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not just the end of a physical barrier, it was the end of an era. It represented the triumph of freedom over tyranny, the victory of unity over division. It was a moment that changed the world, a moment that reminded us all that even the most formidable walls can be brought down by the unwavering spirit of the people. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a symbolic end to the Cold War, a beacon of hope for a brighter, more united future. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, a new world order. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a pivotal moment, but it was just the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. The winds of change sweeping through Eastern Europe soon reached the heart of the Soviet Empire. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was grappling with severe economic stagnation, political unrest, and a growing desire for independence among its satellite states. Mikhail Gorbachev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, attempted to reform the system from within through policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. These reforms aimed to modernize the Soviet economy and make the government more transparent. However, instead of stabilizing the nation, they exposed the deep-seated issues and accelerated its unraveling. As the Soviet grip loosened, nationalist movements gained momentum. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania led the charge, declaring their independence. The domino effect was unstoppable. Other Soviet republics followed suit, each seeking to carve out its own path. The final blow came in August 1991, when a failed coup by hardline communists against Gorbachev further weakened the central government's authority. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, emerged as a key figure, standing atop a tank in front of the Russian parliament building, symbolizing the people's resistance to the old guard. By December 1991, the dissolution was inevitable. On December 25th, Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, and the red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered for the last time over the Kremlin. The Soviet Union was formally dissolved, replaced by the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, marking the end of a superpower and the birth of a new world order. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was a momentous event, reshaping the global political landscape. It marked the end of the Cold War, the triumph of democracy over authoritarianism, and the emergence of new nations from the shadow of Soviet dominance. The world watched as the Iron Curtain was lifted and the former Soviet republics embarked on their journey towards independence and self-determination. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was not just the end of an era, it was the beginning of a new chapter in world history. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the unyielding desire for freedom. The world had changed, and with it, the hopes and aspirations of millions who had lived under the shadow of the Soviet regime. It was a moment of reflection, of looking back at the struggles and sacrifices, and looking forward to a future filled with possibilities. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was a new The Cold War. This term evokes images of espionage, nuclear threats, and a world on the brink. It was a period of geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers that emerged from World War II. The conflict was ideological, with the capitalist West led by the United States and the communist East led by the Soviet Union vying for global dominance. The Cold War was not a hot war with direct military confrontations between the superpowers. However, it was a time of proxy wars, espionage, and a constant arms race. The Cold War cast a long shadow over the globe, shaping international relations and influencing domestic policies in numerous countries. From the late 1940s until the early 1990s, the world watched as these two superpowers engaged in a high-stakes chess match with the fate of humanity hanging in the balance. One of the most potent symbols of this ideological divide was the Berlin Wall, a physical manifestation of the metaphorical Iron Curtain that separated East and West. The Berlin Wall stood as a stark reminder of the human cost of this global standoff. It was a symbol of oppression, division, and the stark realities of life under communist rule. Understanding the Berlin Wall requires understanding the broader context of the Cold War, the events that led to its construction and its eventual fall. In the aftermath of World War II, Germany, the primary aggressor, lay defeated and divided. The victorious Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, divided Germany into 4 occupation zones. Berlin, although located deep within the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4 sectors. This division of Germany and Berlin would become a major point of contention between the East and West. Initially, there were hopes for a unified and democratic Germany. However, these hopes were soon dashed as relations between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies deteriorated. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, began to install communist regimes in Eastern Europe, creating a buffer zone between itself and the West. In 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, was formed from the American, British, and French zones. In response, the Soviet Union established the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, in its zone. The division of Germany solidified the Iron Curtain across Europe. The Iron Curtain symbolized the ideological and physical barrier that separated the communist East from the capitalist West. Movement between East and West became increasingly restricted and tensions continued to escalate. The stage was set for the construction of the Berlin Wall. Berlin, a city situated deep within the Soviet zone of Germany, became a focal point of Cold War tensions. West Berlin, a beacon of freedom and opportunity within communist East Germany, presented a problem for the Soviet Union. Millions of East Germans seeking a better life fled to the West through West Berlin. This mass exodus of skilled workers and intellectuals was a significant drain on the East German economy and an embarrassment to the communist regime. Furthermore, West Berlin stood as a symbol of Western resilience and a challenge to Soviet authority. The Soviets wanted to stop the flow of refugees and consolidate their control over East Germany. The construction of the Berlin Wall was their solution to this problem. It was a drastic measure, but one that the Soviet leadership felt was necessary to secure their interests. In 1961, Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, authorized the construction of the Berlin Wall. He argued that the wall was necessary to protect East Germany from Western aggression and to prevent the capitalist West from undermining the socialist state. However, the true purpose of the wall was clear: to stem the flow of refugees and solidify Soviet control over East Berlin. On August 13, 1961, the world awoke to a startling sight. East German troops and construction workers had begun erecting a barbed wire barrier that would soon become the Berlin Wall. This barrier, initially rudimentary, quickly evolved into a heavily fortified concrete wall complete with guard towers, watchdogs, and shoot-to-kill orders for those attempting to cross. The wall stretched for miles, physically and ideologically dividing East and West Berlin. The construction of the wall sent shockwaves across the globe. Families and friends were separated overnight, unable to cross the divide. The wall became a tangible symbol of Cold War division, a concrete manifestation of the ideological Iron Curtain. The world watched in disbelief as a city, once a symbol of unity and resilience, was brutally cleaved in two. The construction of the Berlin Wall marked a turning point in the Cold War. It solidified the division of East and West and heightened tensions between the superpowers. It also had a profound impact on the lives of ordinary people in Berlin, separating families, friends, and loved ones. The wall would stand for 28 years, a stark reminder of the human cost of the Cold War. Gap 3S. In the early 1960s, the Cold War was in full swing, and tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were at an all-time high. On May 1, 1960, an American U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet airspace. The incident sent shockwaves through the international community. Gap 2S. The U-2 incident exposed the extent of the espionage efforts by the United States and embarrassed the Eisenhower administration. Powers, who survived the crash, was captured by Soviet forces and paraded as evidence of American espionage. The trial and conviction of Powers further strained the already fragile relations between the superpowers. Gap 2S, the downing of the U-2 spy plane, also had a significant impact on the ongoing disarmament talks between the United States and the Soviet Union. The incident led to the collapse of the Paris Summit, a critical meeting aimed at easing Cold War tensions. It became evident that trust between the two nations was at an all-time low. Gap 2S. For the people of Berlin, the U-2 incident was another reminder of the precariousness of their situation. The city stood at the crossroads of East and West, a potential flashpoint for global conflict. The Berlin Wall had only just been erected, and the U-2 incident underscored the dangers lurking beneath the surface of the political divide. Gap 2S. As the world watched the unfolding drama, the Cold War entered a new, more dangerous phase. The downing of the U-2 spy plane highlighted the lengths to which both sides would go to protect their interests and maintain their spheres of influence. It was a stark reminder that the ideological battle between East and West was far from over. Gap 2S. The spy plane incident marked a pivotal moment in Cold War history. It exposed the deep mistrust between the superpowers and demonstrated the high stakes of their geopolitical struggle. For Berliners, it was yet another chapter in their city's tumultuous history, a reminder of the ever-present threat of conflict in a divided world. Gap 3S. In the aftermath of the U-2 incident, diplomatic relations between the United States and the Soviet Union hit a new low. The incident had not only embarrassed the Eisenhower administration, but also shattered any remaining hopes for a swift resolution to Cold War tensions. Gap 2S. The collapse of the Paris Summit was a significant blow to diplomatic efforts. Leaders from the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom and France had gathered with the aim of addressing critical issues such as disarmament and German reunification. However, the U-2 incident cast a long shadow over the proceedings, leading to a swift and acrimonious end to the talks. Gap 2S. The diplomatic fallout was not limited to the superpowers. Allies on both sides of the Iron Curtain were forced to re-evaluate their positions. NATO members expressed concern over the aggressive espionage tactics employed by the United States, while Warsaw Pact countries rallied behind the Soviet Union, condemning American provocations. Gap 2S. For the people of Berlin, the diplomatic fallout further deepened the sense of uncertainty and fear. The city, already divided by the newly constructed Berlin Wall, now found itself at the epicenter of a geopolitical tug-of-war. Families were separated, and the hope for reunification seemed more distant than ever. Gap 2S. The U-2 incident also had lasting effects on international espionage. Both superpowers ramped up their intelligence-gathering efforts, leading to a new era of covert operations and counterintelligence. The skies above Europe became a battleground for reconnaissance aircraft and spy satellites, each side seeking to outmaneuver the other. Gap 2S. As the world grappled with the implications of the U-2 incident, one thing became clear: the Cold War was far from over. The diplomatic fallout underscored the fragile nature of peace in a divided world where trust was a rare commodity and the threat of conflict loomed large. Gap 2S. The diplomatic fallout of the U-2 incident was a sobering reminder of the complexities of international relations during the Cold War. It highlighted the precarious balance of power and the ever-present risk of escalation. For the citizens of Berlin, it was yet another chapter in their ongoing struggle for freedom and unity in a world divided by ideology. Gap 3S. Gap 3S, the U-2 incident and the subsequent diplomatic fallout left a lasting mark on the Cold War landscape. Trust between the superpowers had been shattered and the world braced for the next inevitable confrontation. Gap 2S. In Berlin, the impact was immediate and profound. The Berlin Wall, already a symbol of division, now seemed an impenetrable barrier to any hope of reunification. Families torn apart by the wall faced an even bleaker future as the political climate grew colder and more hostile. Gap 2S. The United States and the Soviet Union doubled down on their military and espionage efforts. In the skies, reconnaissance missions became even more frequent and daring, each side seeking to gain the upper hand in a game of high-stakes espionage. The shadow of the U-2 incident loomed large over every mission, a constant reminder of the risks involved. Gap 2S. On the ground, the people of Berlin lived in a state of perpetual tension. The wall was not just a physical barrier, it was a constant reminder of the ideological divide that had come to define their lives. Every day they faced the harsh realities of a city and a world torn apart by conflicting ideologies. Gap 2S. Diplomatic channels remained strained, with little hope for meaningful dialogue. The leaders of the superpowers continued to posture and provoke, each move calculated to demonstrate strength and resolve. The possibility of a peaceful resolution seemed more remote than ever. Gap 2S. Yet amid the uncertainty and fear, the human spirit endured. Acts of defiance and bravery emerged as symbols of resistance against the oppressive regimes. Stories of escape attempts, some successful and others tragic, became part of the city's lore, a testament to the enduring desire for freedom and unity. Gap 2S. The aftermath of the U-2 incident was a sobering reminder of the precarious nature of peace during the Cold War. It underscored the fragility of international relations and the ever-present threat of escalation. For the citizens of Berlin, it was a stark reminder that their struggle for freedom was far from over. Gap 3S. As the world continued to navigate the treacherous waters of the Cold War, the lessons of the U-2 incident would not be forgotten. They served as a cautionary tale of the dangers of espionage and the complexities of diplomacy in an era defined by suspicion and rivalry. Gap 3S. Gap 3S. The Cold War, already simmering with tension, escalated rapidly in the wake of the U-2 incident. Both superpowers were now on high alert, their military arsenals growing at an unprecedented rate. Gap 2S. In the United States, the government ramped up its defense budget, investing heavily in new technologies and advanced weaponry. The space race, too, became a crucial battleground, with both nations vying for supremacy in the final frontier. Gap 2S. Across the Atlantic, the Soviet Union responded in kind. Parades showcasing their military might became a common sight, a clear message to the world that they were ready for any confrontation. The development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, further heightened the stakes, bringing the threat of nuclear war ever closer. Gap 2S. In Berlin, the city remained a focal point of this escalating conflict. The Berlin Wall, now fortified with additional security measures, became even more impenetrable. Surveillance was intensified, and any attempt to cross the border was met with swift and severe punishment. Gap 2S. The airwaves were flooded with propaganda from both sides, each portraying the other as the ultimate enemy. The media became a tool of psychological warfare, aiming to sway public opinion and maintain national morale. Gap 2S. For the people of Berlin, life became a daily struggle for survival. Resources were scarce, and the constant threat of conflict loomed large. Yet, amid the hardship, a spirit of resilience emerged. Underground networks formed to help those in need, and acts of kindness and solidarity became a quiet form of resistance. Gap 2S. Internationally, alliances were tested and new ones formed. NATO and the Warsaw Pact nations stood in stark opposition, each ready to defend their ideological territories. The world watched anxiously as the superpowers engaged in a dangerous dance, their every move scrutinized for signs of aggression. Gap 2S. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, a stark reminder of the fragile peace that hung by a thread. The resolution of the crisis, though a temporary reprieve, did little to ease the underlying tensions. Gap 2S. The Cold War had entered a new, more dangerous phase. The lessons of the past seemed forgotten as both sides prepared for an uncertain future. For the citizens of Berlin and the world, the hope for peace remained a distant dream, overshadowed by the ever-present threat of global conflict. Gap 3S. Gap 3S, October 1962. The world stood on the edge of a precipice as the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded. Gap 2S, American reconnaissance revealed that the Soviet Union was secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The discovery sent shockwaves through the US government, triggering a tense 13-day standoff that brought the superpowers to the brink of nuclear war. Gap 2S. President John F. Kennedy addressed the nation, informing the public of the imminent threat and announcing a naval blockade to prevent further Soviet shipments of military equipment to Cuba. The announcement was met with a mixture of fear and resolve, as Americans braced for what could be an imminent conflict. Gap 2S. In the Kremlin, Premier Nikita Khrushchev faced immense pressure. The Soviet leader had to decide whether to escalate the situation or seek a diplomatic resolution. Communication channels between Washington and Moscow buzzed with urgent messages, each side wary of misinterpretation or miscalculation. Gap 2S. As the US Navy enforced the blockade, Soviet ships carrying additional missile supplies approached the quarantine line. The world watched with bated breath, knowing that a single misstep could trigger a catastrophic war. Gap 2S. Backdoor negotiations intensified, with both superpowers seeking a way to defuse the crisis without losing face. Eventually, a secret agreement was reached. The Soviet Union would dismantle its missiles in Cuba in exchange for the US promising not to invade the island and secretly agreeing to remove its own missiles from Turkey. Gap 2S. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba, marking the end of the immediate crisis. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the close call left an indelible mark on international relations. Gap 2S. The Cuban Missile Crisis underscored the devastating potential of nuclear weapons and highlighted the need for more effective communication between superpowers. It led to the establishment of a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow, a tangible step toward preventing future misunderstandings. Gap 2S. Yet, the underlying tensions of the Cold War persisted. The crisis had shown just how fragile global peace was, and the specter of nuclear annihilation continued to loom over the world. For the people of Berlin and beyond, the hope for a lasting peace remained elusive, overshadowed by the ever-present threat of renewed conflict. Gap 3S. Gap 3S. As the dust settled from the Cuban Missile Crisis, a new battleground emerged in the Cold War space. Gap 2S. The space race became a symbol of technological prowess and ideological superiority, with both the United States and the Soviet Union vying for dominance beyond Earth's atmosphere. Gap 2S. In 1957, the Soviet Union took an early lead by launching Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. The achievement stunned the world and sent the United States into a frenzy, spurring the creation of NASA in 1958. Gap 2S. The competition intensified, with each side pushing the boundaries of human ingenuity. Gap 2S. The Soviets made another significant leap in 1961 when cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth. His successful mission was a monumental triumph for the USSR and a stark reminder of the stakes involved in this celestial contest. Gap 2S. Determined to catch up, the United States poured resources into its space program, culminating in President Kennedy's ambitious pledge to land a man on the moon before the decade was out. Gap 2S. The Apollo program became the centerpiece of America's efforts, showcasing the nation's technological might and unyielding spirit. Gap 2S. On July 20, 1969, the world watched in awe as Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the lunar surface, uttering the iconic words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Gap 2S. The moon landing was not just a victory for the United States, it was a testament to human potential and the power of exploration. Gap 2S. While the space race was fueled by rivalry, it also fostered a sense of wonder and possibility. Gap 2S. The advancements made during this period laid the groundwork for future space exploration and cooperation, reminding humanity of what could be achieved when we reach for the stars. Gap 2S. Yet even as astronauts ventured into space, the Cold War's terrestrial conflicts continued to simmer. Gap 3S. The space race may have been won, but the struggle for global influence was far from over. Gap 3S. Gap 3S. As the Cold War stretched into the late 20th century, the Berlin Wall stood as a grim symbol of division and oppression. Gap 2S. Erected in 1961, it not only split East and West Berlin, but also embodied the ideological chasm between communism and democracy. Gap 2S. For nearly 3 decades, families were separated, lives were lost, and the Iron Curtain seemed impenetrable. Gap 2S. Yet beneath the surface, the winds of change were beginning to stir. Gap 2S. In the 1980s, a wave of reform swept through the Soviet Union under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev. Gap 2S. His policies of glasnost and perestroika aimed to open up the Soviet society and economy, creating ripples of hope across Eastern Europe. Gap 2S. Meanwhile, in East Germany, discontent was growing. Gap 2S. Citizens began to demand greater freedoms and an end to the oppressive regime. Gap 2S. The pressure reached a tipping point on November 9, 1989, when a botched announcement led to the opening of the Berlin Wall. Gap 2S. That night, thousands of East Berliners surged through the checkpoints, reuniting with their Western counterparts in scenes of jubilation and disbelief. Gap 2S. The fall of the Berlin Wall was more than just a physical collapse. It marked the beginning of the end for the Cold War. Gap 2S. It symbolized the triumph of human spirit over tyranny and the yearning for unity and freedom. Gap 2S. In the months that followed, the momentum of change continued to sweep through Eastern Europe, leading to the collapse of communist regimes and the reunification of Germany in 1990. Gap 2S. The fall of the Berlin Wall remains one of the most poignant moments in history, a testament to the power of hope and the inevitability of change. Gap 2S. It serves as a reminder that even the most formidable barriers can be overcome when people unite for a common cause. Gap 3S. With the wall down and the Cold War nearing its end, the world stood on the brink of a new era, one filled with both challenges and opportunities. Gap 3S. Gap 3S. As the Berlin Wall fell, the world watched in awe. But this monumental event was just the beginning of the end for the Cold War. Gap 2S. The collapse of the Soviet Union was imminent, but the journey to that point was fraught with complex political maneuvers and dramatic shifts in global power. Gap 2S. In the early 1990s, the Soviet economy was in shambles and its political structure was crumbling. Gap 2S. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms had opened the floodgates for change, but they also exposed deep-seated weaknesses within the Soviet system. Gap 2S. Nationalist movements gained momentum, and republics within the Soviet Union began to declare independence. Gap 2S. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were among the first to break away, setting a precedent for others to follow. Gap 2S. In August 1991, a failed coup by hardline communists attempted to reverse Gorbachev's reforms, but it only hastened the Soviet Union's demise. Gap 2S. Boris Yeltsin, then president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, emerged as a key figure, rallying the people against the coup plotters and solidifying his power. Gap 2S. By December 1991, the Soviet Union was officially dissolved, marking the end of an era. Gap 2S. The United States and its allies celebrated the collapse of their longtime adversary, but the aftermath was complex and multifaceted. Gap 2S. The end of the Cold War brought new challenges, including the transition to market economies, the rise of new political dynamics, and the need for international cooperation in a rapidly changing world. Gap 2S. The dissolution of the Soviet Union also led to the emergence of new nations, each with its own unique path to forge in the post-Cold War era. Gap 2S. Despite the uncertainties, the end of the Cold War symbolized the triumph of diplomacy and the potential for a more peaceful world. Gap 2S. It was a time of reflection, as the global community considered the lessons learned from decades of tension and conflict. Gap 2S. The end of the Cold War was not just the conclusion of a geopolitical struggle, it was the dawn of a new age, one where the hope for lasting peace and cooperation could finally take root. Gap 3S. As we look back on this pivotal moment in history, we are reminded